Pumpkin Spice Podcast, coming at you with an incredibly frightening and spooky bonus episode this October. I'm Rob Schulte, and today I'm joined by a special guest. She's the managing editor for Daily Dead, the author of Monster Squad, celebrating the artists behind cinema's most memorable creatures, and she's a member of the advisory board for a new documentary called In Search of Darkness. It's Heather Wixson. Hi, Heather. Welcome to Pumpkin Spice Podcast.
Hey, Rob. Thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to chat about some horror stuff and also 80s horror especially.
It is kind of the best way to dip any sort of toes into horror, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say it's probably the most accessible decade for horror, I think, because I feel like 70s, you have to sort of respect the aesthetic a little bit more, and sort of what the things that they were pushing at that time. In 80s, I mean, there was definitely things that were thought-provoking happening in that decade, but it was a decade about fun in the genre.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
There's no martyrs happening in the 80s.
Before we get into today's episode, can you tell me a little bit about Monster Squad and your day-to-day relationship with horror films?
Yes, absolutely. So I have been writing about horror movies now professionally for about 11 years, and I've been over at Daily Dead now for 5. Basically what I do there is I do a lot of our interviews and reviews. For as much as a lot of my career is sort of centered around the history of the genre. That's just something that's always really appealed to me, but I'm also really big into finding new horror to kind of fall in love with, especially like through film festivals and stuff like that. So I've just been really fortunate that, I was a little horror geek growing up in the suburbs of Chicago that somehow managed to find a way to make this into a career, which I still can't believe even after over this much time now. I'm still kind of waking up every day like, wow, this is really my life. But yeah, I've always been sort of a big fan of like the underdogs out there. And I always thought, not that they weren't always getting their credit, but I don't feel like a lot of folks really appreciated the things that special effects artists were doing in order for us to kind of fall in love with these movies. I mean, they do these creations, they give up their lives because it is a very demanding position. And I just felt like for as many books and, articles and things like that out there that talked about like the how-tos and sort of the overall monsters, nothing really dived into the lives of these people who, were responsible for some of our favorite monsters that we've seen over the years. So that was my intention with Monster Squad. Is that,
I love it.
Yeah, I wanted to just, put these people's lives out there because I feel like, oh yeah, like that's cool that they worked on this or it's cool they worked on that. But if you kind of hear the stories maybe behind them, it gives you a little more insight, I think. And also, and I'm not saying this in a bad way about like, the bigger guys like, the Rick Bakers and the Tom Savinis and the Stan Winstons and stuff. But there's a lot of times when I'll see, especially now after going through this process for over 2.5 years where somebody's like, oh, I really love this monster from Stan Winston. And I was like, technically, I mean, that's 5 other guys, and that was their passion and stuff. And that's not me trying to disrespect Stan Winston because what he did for this industry is, unprecedented in terms of making sure artists were being represented on a business side of things. But he was, he was kind of the figurehead at certain points. And so it was guys, like Steve Wang or Tom Woodruff Jr. or Alec Gillis or Shane Mahan, John Rosengrant, those kind of guys. These are the guys whose stories should deserve to be out there just as much. And so that was kind of the focus of what I was doing. And so the first one is out there and the second one I'm working on wrapping up now. So it's been, it's been a several years process. I've learned a lot and it's been it's an incredible thing. Like the fact that these people trust me with their life stories. Like I never in a million years would have, imagine that could have happened. Like I was surprised the first yes I got, let alone the 44th yes I got. So it's been really incredible.
Totally. I know exactly where you're coming from. We were actually talking about Monster Squad. A buddy of mine who's a writer out here in New York named Mike Sachs, and he was telling me that it was one of his well, we were talking about all sorts of special effects in general, but anytime he picks up a book that has like detailed histories of that sort of thing, it's like his favorite thing to do. And he did something very similar with comedy writers, where you go through and just like, I can't believe I got one interview and I can't believe I got all the rest. And it's so great how when you can go into, whether it be comedy, special effects, horror, the people who want to talk are just ready to talk for days and days, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my interviews that I did for book one, I think clocked in well over 5.5 hours when everything was said and done. So it definitely, it helped with my interviewing skills a lot too, because some of these would, I'd be on the phone with them for 2 to 3 to sometimes 5 hours. So it was a really great process for me. And I'm just happy that I was able to put these folks in the spotlight a little bit because they really deserved it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Before we get into the meat of today's episode, can you give me a little bit of an overview of In Search of Darkness?
Yeah, so this project kind of came onto my radar a few months ago when I sort of saw it pop up on Twitter. And really, this is all sort of the brainchild of Robin Block, who's put together an amazing team of people who, want to come together and celebrate, what we easily feel like is the best decade of horror. So I came into it, about a month and a half ago. And initially it was just to kind of come on board to, be one of the participants. And then because I'm so fortunate in what I do that I've been able to kind of get dialed into the community a little bit here in Los Angeles, I've been able to kind of bring some other folks on, in terms of talent and stuff like that, especially because some of the spotlight is going to be on the special effects throughout the 80s because it really was this golden age of modern effects. And so, it's been incredible to see this all come together the way that it has. Like we've brought in some of the biggest talents in terms of directors, and being able to have, a lot of the actors involved, people who grew up loving horror, who've gone on to do great things in the genre world, like Lee Winnell, we've got Joe Dante, Mick Garris is involved. I mean, it really is sort of this who's who celebration. And it's really exciting for me because we've had so many amazing genre documentaries over the years. I mean, you have like Never Sleep Again, Crystal Lake Memories, you have Leviathan that did the Hellraiser movies, the Fright Night documentary, but nothing has sort of had this sort of encapsulating look at the 1980s in the context of what this decade of horror really meant. Because as we talked a little bit before, it was a really fun decade for horror, but, there were some things that were being pushed through the genre in ways that, maybe we hadn't seen before, like movie, obviously there's They Live, which we're pretty much living in these days, and you have movies like The Fly, that were kind of looking at some of the social issues that were coming up throughout the 1980s. So it's really a fascinating time, I think, in horror because it's the most enjoyable, but I also think it's one of, sort of the most envelope pushing in a lot of ways, because we were starting to shake up some of these things that had sort of become traditions in the genre and kind of putting a new spin on them. And for me, I think, I was fortunate enough to grow up during the decade because I'm old. So, so I feel very fortunate that I got to live through a lot of this stuff. And I think I'm hoping, that this will be something that, fans who grew up in this decade will enjoy it. But I'm really hoping also that for fans who are younger, who are maybe newer to the horror genre and stuff like that, this is a really good gateway for them. Because, we sometimes as horror fans can be a little territorial, but for me, I'm all about more the merrier. So if this is something that some kid watches who's 15 years old and somehow dives headfirst into the horror genre because of what we've been able to put together for this, that's so cool to me. And I really hope it does.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah, so
for sure.
That's how we keep getting good horror fans throughout the years. We have to give them good stuff.
Absolutely. And just even the teaser trailer for this, when I went to 80s horror film or 80shorrordoc.com, I was blown away. I immediately sent an email and I was like, how can I help with this show? Because I know exactly where you're coming from. Sometimes it feels like there's a gate, or people can be gatekeepers, but once you pass through and you realize that these films can be for absolutely everyone, and there's an angle to enjoy on most of these films, whether it be social issues or just straight up a fun, goofy horror movie. There's a little something for everyone.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I also think just because too, we're, everything kind of headed in the 90s with digital and stuff like that. And that's not a knock, because I do think, there is a time and place for digital effects. We wouldn't have a lot of our favorite movies without them. But I think when the industry began to sort of favor those instead of practical effects, it made it for kind of a sort of drab time in horror. And that's not to say that there aren't really great 90s horror movies with amazing effects, because there are. Things like Demon Knight is like one of my favorites.
Universal Pictures is proud to present the motion picture directing debut of one of America's most talented and respected artists.
Cut! Cut, 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 cut! Oh, hello, kiddies. So glad you could join me. Your pal, the Crypt Keeper, has gone Hollywood in a big way. I'm directing my first feature film. Care for a little shriek preview? For my big scream premiere, I wanted lots of suspense. Uh-oh. Special effects, sex, violence. The kind of thing you could really sink your teeth into. Frights! Camera! Action!
But I think, the 80s, it was just like a decade where everything felt possible. And then the 90s, it kind of felt like everybody was pulling back because they were scared again, because it's a money industry still, making movies, it should be fun. But at the end of the day, somebody needs to make money. And I think the 90s is where we start to see it pull back. And then, thankfully the 2000s is when we really started to see things getting pushed on the independent side. And I think that's why we're now in this boom where we're getting great stuff on the independent side, but we're also getting really good stuff on the studio side. And it's been a very long time since I think you could say that about this genre. I would actually say the last time may have been the 80s.
Yeah, I was having a very similar conversation the other day about how things are starting to seem exciting again, because people are, specifically, we were talking about the Child's Play news that has been coming out lately.
It's so confusing as a fan, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, I don't know which is which anymore. I just know I want to follow the Don Mancini train, but I'm like, but what? Yeah, it's confusing.
But I love that, if Don is going to be like combating with the folks making a remake, it's like, okay, if everyone wants to fight to make the best thing possible, I am okay with that.
Yeah, that's true. That's how competition breeds creativity, I think, in a lot of ways. So, I mean, it could end up being a great thing for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Speaking of the 80s, we thought we would, tackle a classic that we've looked at in this podcast before, but we haven't looked at with this special guest. Heather, thank you for being on here to talk about Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street.
It's one of those, because when we were talking about a movie, I was like, oh gosh, I don't even know what to say about Nightmare on Elm Street anymore at this point, because it is such a classic. But then I was like, my head started kind of rolling. I was like, I don't know how I could not talk about Nightmare on Elm Street at the same time.
Yeah, it's just like, why not take the classic on? It stars Heather Langenkamp, Johnny Depp, and of course Robert Englund, bringing the full body of Freddy Krueger to the screen. Something that I think is quickly overlooked until you take a few steps in, of just like how lively this character, or how dead this character would be without Robert Englund.
Oh, for sure. And I've always been really fascinated by this idea that originally it was supposed to be David Warner, which is why he pops up in a lot of Wes's movies later on. Because I love David. I don't know what that energy would have been like. I feel like it might have been a little more Phantom-esque, maybe,
Sure.
because of sort of that gravitas that he brings. And that's not to say that Robert doesn't have that, but Robert has a little bit of a different energy, I think, when he's on screen. So that for me, I always play that in the back of my head, especially like during Scream 2, whenever I'm watching, I'm like, you could have been Freddy Krueger. What would this have been like? But I love that we have Robert. I think Robert, of course, is the cornerstone of this franchise, because regardless of how not awesome certain installments in this franchise might be, they're always still at least worth watching because of Robert. And that's not to take away anything from sort of the Elm Street players, if you will, because, we wouldn't be anywhere without Heather Langenkamp, because she became this emotional center for this franchise, through this first movie, which is really incredible if you think about it, because if you look at this, this is I think this is one of her very first film roles ever.
I believe so.
And you have her acting alongside, Ronnie Blakely and John Saxon, who at this point were very seasoned in their careers. And she's just as good. Like, she's
so powerful.
Yeah. And so to see this, this raw young talent coming in with these sort of, seasoned performers, and then Robert coming in to kind of, it's this beautiful sort of nightmarish opera, if you will, in a way, because it culminates in this big finale. And it really was, there's a lot of movies that scared me as a kid, but Freddy is probably the first one in terms of villains that really, really stuck with me.
Oh, same here. Just the idea of like a shadowy figure with a hat is something that as a child, I saw one of those images when my brother was watching A Nightmare on Elm Street, and my brain just stretched it to something that was totally un-Freddy Krueger, but then when I saw Freddy Krueger, was even frightened more than where my imagination went.
Yeah, and that's one of the movies where it really it taps into something very basic, but does it in a way that is so beautifully over the top in a lot of ways, especially when he has like that attack scene with Amanda Wyss.
Please, God.
This is God.
It really, like, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be like a teenager experiencing that movie for the first time in '84. Like, I was a little kid who experienced it on VHS, but to be in that audience and have that energy, like, people must have been losing their minds, and I love that.
Yeah, any sort of film that has that lasting effect on people has been fantastic, and that when you can talk about it for days, just like we are now, you've got something special. So with that, let's go into an IMDb user-generated storyline. It goes like this. This is what popped up on my screen. On Elm Street, Nancy Thompson and a group of her friends are being tormented by a clawed killer in their dreams named Fred Krueger. Nancy must think quickly as Fred tries to pick them off one by one. When he has you in your sleep, who is there to save you? Written by a guy named Simon. I think Simon did a fairly decent job there, but it can be extrapolated even further. Did you have any huge takeaways the first or every time you watch A Nightmare on Elm Street?
The thing that always, I think what struck me about Nightmare on Elm Street when I was a kid, kind of falling in love with the genre, it's the first movie, and I know it wasn't the first movie that ever did this, but it was the first movie I ever saw where a filmmaker was playing with your perceptions of reality and kind of pulling away these layers of, oh, you think you're awake, but you're really asleep. And again, I know it's not the first movie to ever do that, but it's the first movie that I ever saw do that. And for me, I think that's what really kind of screwed with my own sensibilities, is because we all have to sleep at some point. So how do you defeat somebody, or how do you survive somebody that, biologically you cannot, because eventually you have to sleep, or your body is just going to shut down. And if it shuts down, you're asleep, So it was one of those movies where it felt hopeless, but hopeful, because Nancy was so resourceful and she wasn't willing to just stand by and let these things happen, that she took things, matters in her own hand and, into her own hands. And I think we get the sort of the doing everything around the house montage, which is one of my favorite staples of like any movie, regardless of genre, is sort of the do-it-yourself montage where you're getting ready for the big battle. But Nancy's is my favorite because it was things that I could relate to. Like, oh, if there's, somebody coming for you, find a way to trip them. Or, I don't have shotgun shells to, put into my light bulbs or anything, but I could try to hoist some sort of device that would hit somebody if they opened a door. And I just thought, for a movie that was so fantastic, and so driven by this entity that existed on a completely different playing field, the way that Craven then brings it all into this sort of relatable, environment for this finale is just, it was something really special, something I'd never seen before. And I think that's why these movies meant so much to me. I mean, other than the fact that I thought it was super cool that the girl playing Nancy, happened to also be named Heather. So, that was something as a kid, I was like, that's really cool. And then when she was on Just the 10 of Us, forget about it. It was just the perfect movie for me at that point. And it was interesting to me. And I don't know how this happened. And maybe it was because of Dream Warriors, but the first probably 20 times I first watched Nightmare on Elm Street, I was terrified of Freddy Krueger. And I remember even the first night I watched it, because my mom was iffy about it, but my babysitter had a copy of it. And she had left me there over the night because she had to work weekends. And so I was like, oh, Judy, can I watch Nightmare on Elm Street? And I just watched Children of the Corn. And she was like, yeah, whatever. And I remember having to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, as a 7-year-old. And I'm trying to not touch the walls, because in my mind, if I touch the walls, Freddy's going to come through them, because he just did that. So I was just running really fast and running back. And I just kept my eye focused on the nightlight. And and that's the thing, that's the earmark of great cinematic experiences, is that you can remember everything about that experience. And there's, we've all watched hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of movies over our time. But if you look at those moments where you can remember everything, like the smell in the air, how it felt, that you're in the middle of something special. And, I've watched a ton of 80s horror movies, and a lot of them have come and gone. But there's probably about 20 of them where I can tell you every little thing about those experiences, because those ended up being some of the greatest movies ever.
Oh, well, that is absolutely wonderful. I know exactly where you're coming from, especially on the tactile purpose of taste and smell and just being immersed 100% in it. One of my last questions for the podcast I'd like to ask people is, was there anything that made you go,
that make you go,
anything that either stood out more so than it ever did before for the negative or positive?
There's always things about 80s movies where you're like, oh, you can see where the little seams in the budget kind of come through and stuff like that. It's funny to me that I always found the staircase sequence really scary. And now it just looks really delicious to me. I'm like, ooh, that's a lot of marshmallow right there. I'm trying to think. Oh, you know what? This is my favorite thing. If you watch the scene with Charles Fleischer when they have Nancy in the clinic and they're doing the dream testing with her, there is a really hysterical cat poster on his wall where the cat, I think, is riding a trolley in San Francisco.
Oh my God.
And
I'm going to have to go back and check that out again.
Yes, I'm obsessed with that poster. I know somebody actually filled me in on Twitter, and they said they think it's part of one of the Scholastic Book Fair poster books that they used to do with cats.
Yep, I remember those.
So if anybody ever finds that poster, that's kind of one of my weird holy grails of horror, is to find this weird cat poster from Nightmare. So if you watch it, just look for that poster. You'll see it. You'll know it when you see it. And
then it'll be the only thing we can see in that scene for the rest of our days.
Exactly. Charles Fleischer is going to completely disappear for you after that.
Oh, great. Well, Heather, thank you so much for being on the show today. I have had a blast talking with you. Obviously, you are one of the best when it comes to horror news and just bringing the history into this for everyone. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And could you please direct people where they can find you online, or possibly the best way for them to buy your book?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the book is available on Amazon. I don't have one of the fancy links where it's like Amazon.com/ like Monster Squad or anything like that. But if you go search Monster Squad book on there, it should pop up for you. For me, you can find all my writing over at dailydead.com. Over on Twitter, I'm at The Horror Chick. And for anybody who wants to learn more about the documentary as well, you can follow over at Twitter at 80s Horror Doc there. And then also for the Kickstarter campaign, I believe if you just do a quick search of in the Kickstarter website where it just says In Search of Darkness, I think it comes up like, it's going to be the #1 project. Or even if you look up 80s horror, I believe it's the first thing that pops up too. So, it really is a labor of love by a lot of people who really love this decade of horror and want to celebrate it the right way. And we've been really fortunate that we've kind of blown away all of our initial goals, but we're still going, and we still, want people to be a part of this because it is a community thing, because the horror genre is a community. Do you know what I mean? Like, we are all the people, who've grown up loving these things and maybe felt a little weird, compared to the other folks in the world. And this is sort of like our moment, especially for those of us who grew up in the 80s. So I just can't talk enough about how much it means to be a part of this. So I really hope people will check it out.
I know they will. Everyone listening now, make sure you go out and do this. It's a great project to support. And thanks again for listening to Pumpkin Spice Podcast. If you're tweeting about it online, use the hashtag Pumpkin Spice Podcast. And I'm Rob Schulte. You can find me at Rob, the letter K, SCHULTE. Heather, once again, thanks a bunch. This has been a wonderful time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm always up to talk Nightmare on Elm Street.
All right. Well, then that'll be it for this week, and we'll see everyone next time.